Good afternoon and welcome to SEND Training. I wanted to start our session off today with a quote from the SEND Code of Practice of 2015, and that's looking at all teachers are responsible for every child in their care, including those with special educational needs. I really hope by the end of this session you're able to take away some valuable knowledge to be able to enhance your teaching and to be able to remove barriers to education for our young learners. I thought it was probably appropriate to start with an overview of our SEN at Framilgate at the moment. So within school we currently have 14 students with an EHCP, 81 students who are on the SEN support register, and 76 students which are currently being monitored on our SEN register. We're currently applying for 5 EHC top-up requests and 6 students to access higher additional needs top-up funding. Those two bottom areas are really important because actually without those processes in place, we're unable to access additional support for these students, which I'm sure you can agree, a lot of these students really do need that support. When we look at SEND, there's 4 key areas. Our students that are on the special educational needs registers will fall within one or multiples of these areas. So we're looking at communicating and interacting, cognition and learning, social, emotional, mental health, and sensory and or physical needs. Now, I really appreciate that everybody in the department will have a lot of different ideas. They'll have a lot of different training. So it's really difficult to pitch the training to the right level. So I really hope that everyone's able to take something away. I do apologise to those members of staff that have a wealth of SEN knowledge. And so I really do hope that we're able to unpick this today and everyone's able to take away something that's able to support the students within the classroom. So looking at our SEND area of need. When we're looking at communicating and interacting, that's our students who have speech and language communication difficulties, and it makes it very difficult for them to make sense of language and or to understand and how to communicate effectively and appropriately with others. So we're looking at SEND area of need. The students that we'll be looking at, for example, are students that have a diagnosis of autism. They have social skill difficulties. They may have pathological demand avoidance. That's just a small section within that SEND area of need. But it makes us understand, actually, when we're thinking about these students, these are the students that really are struggling to be able to communicate and interact with others. So how can we support that? We've got cognition and learning. So it's students who learn at a slower pace than others their age, have difficulty in understanding parts of the curriculum, and have difficulties with organisation and memory skills, or have a specific difficulty affecting one particular part of the learning performance, such as literacy or numeracy. When we're looking at these students, it's thinking about those that have a diagnosis of dyslexia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. We also have those students that have social, emotional, mental health difficulties. So students who have difficulty in managing their relationships with other people, they're withdrawn, or they behave in a way that may hinder theirs and other children's learning or have an impact on their health and well-being. When we're thinking about these students, it's thinking about those that have a diagnosis of ADHD. They may be they may be suffering with anorexia, or they may have an anxiety disorder. And finally, we've got our sensory and or physical needs. So this is students that may have a visual and or a hearing impairment. They may have a physical need. That means that they have additional ongoing support and they may access equipment. So for example, we're thinking about students that have sensory processing difficulties or a visual or hearing impairment. It's really important to note though that actually some of our learners, and quite a few of our learners, they cover more than one of these areas. So it's about getting that balance right and looking at their primary need. And once we're able to support that primary need, we then can move on to the secondary and tertiary needs. So SEND in your classroom, I just want to do this as a bit of a pause point, please. So in your departments, think about your classes. Which SEND area of need do you support in your lessons? Include examples of each area of need, and can you match these to your students that you're currently supporting within your classrooms? If you just pause, thank you. Okay, so I think probably from when you're looking at your class in your department, I'm sure you've all been able to identify that actually you're covering all 4 of these SEND area of need, and you'll have a wealth of students that you're supporting that have a special educational need. It's about being able to unpick that. So when I have a little look at what we support within Framilgate School, this is just a list. It's not exhaustive at all. However, it's really important that we understand we are supporting all of these students in school. You'll notice that I've left 3 that are in red. Now my reason for that is that's the 3 area of need that we're really going to focus on in this session. It would be lovely to think I could get through all of them, but in the time constraints we have, it just wouldn't be possible. So we're going to really focus on ADHD, autism and dyspraxia. The reason for that is that so far this year, the amount of inquiries I've had from department and curriculum leaders, or I've had from staff, it's been mainly around these three areas. And I think that's because these are the ones that we really struggle in the classroom to be able to support the most. So by looking at these, we're going to start with ADHD. So ADHD, it is known as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It is a behavioural disorder that includes symptoms such as inattentiveness, hyperactivity and impulsiveness. So remember, ADHD falls within our social, emotional, mental health area of need. It's probably no surprise that students that have a diagnosis of ADHD, they also have problems maybe with their sleep and anxiety disorders. Our students on the register with ADHD, a wealth of students actually have their medication to help them sleep. They may also be on medications to help them to reduce those inattentiveness, that hyperactivity, that impulsiveness, and the medication allows them to be a little bit more calm within the classroom. We know that that's not always the case, and we're still going to have difficulties with some of these students. However, it's understanding the difference between behaviour and actually what is their ADHD. Symptoms of ADHD tend to be noticed at an early age and may become more noticeable when a child's circumstances change. So that might be things like starting school, it may be puberty, or it could be a life event. So I've done this into two sections, and it's looking at the main signs of inattentiveness and it's looking at the main signs of hyperactivity and impulsiveness. So if we start on the left-hand side and we're looking at those inattentiveness, what are we looking at? So it's having a short attention span and being easily distracted. Making careless mistakes, for example, not underlining using a ruler no matter how many times we're asking this student to do something. Appearing forgetful or losing things. Being unable to stick to tasks that are tedious or time consuming. Appearing to be unable to listen to or carry out instructions. Constantly changing activity or task. And having difficulty organising tasks. I'm sure by the time you've read all of that list, you're already starting to think of students in your classroom. You're thinking of the students that you know have a diagnosis of ADHD. And it's really important that we're able to really decipher between what is that ADHD characteristic and what is behaviour. So when we move over to the right-hand side and we're looking at hyperactivity and impulsiveness, the things that we would look as characteristics with a student with ADHD would be being unable to sit still, especially in a calm or quiet surrounding. Constantly fidgeting, being unable to concentrate on tasks, excessive physical movement, excessive talking, being unable to wait their turn, acting without thinking, interrupting conversations, little or no sense of danger. So there's a wealth of information and characteristics that we can take from students that display ADHD tendencies. What we might find is that some students may have a diagnosis of ADHD, whereas others may display these traits, but they don't have a diagnosis. So things that in the classroom that we have, so you'll notice that students will have fidget toys, and you'll notice that students may have things to distract them, things like putty, they may have blue tack, they may have a tangle toy, they may have a fidget pen. All of these things are able to support students. I've just placed an order also for some wiggle cushions, and because we have some of our students in year 7 who find it very difficult to be able to sit in their chair, especially when they're asked to do extended writing. So this idea of a cushion they would sit on, and it allows them to move and it gives them that movement and it stops them from being in a position where they feel actually they're unable to carry out a task because they really need to be moving around and they need to be able to self-regulate in a way. You'll notice at the bottom of the slide, I've put a little clip on YouTube, and it's about ADHD and motivation, and it's looking at this child with ADHD and actually the difficulties that they have. And I think it's a really important video to watch. So I'm going to ask you just to pause and watch that video, please. Thank you. So after watching that video, I'm sure you can probably start to understand actually the complexities for a child that has ADHD. So what's really important is how can we support those students in our classroom? What can we do to ensure that we're removing the barriers to allow them to learn? So think about the students you teach who have a diagnosis of ADHD. How can you change your approach to teaching and help students build planks on their bridge to enable them to succeed? And I want you to select 3 classroom strategies that you'll adopt and trial in your lessons from now until the end of term, because I want to be able to measure that impact. Have you seen a difference for these students? Because if you have, that's great. And what we'll do is at the end of the term, I want to be able to come together and look at the students that have a diagnosis of ADHD. What strategies have you put in that you've noticed a remarkable difference and it's actually had a real impact in your classroom? We'll be then able to feed that back and be able to share that across the school, so it means that our classroom strategies that are on Mint Class and on our pupil profiles are really personal and individual to that child. So I'm just going to pause the video. I just want you to be able to give that a go. If you can answer both those questions and come back to me in a couple of minutes. Thank you. So just to finish on students with ADHD, I just wanted to give you one thought, so top tips for teaching students with ADHD. So always produce a waggle. Students struggle to visualise the end result. So issuing this along with a checklist, and think back to Helen's training about recount and recall and looking at dual coding, being able to break that task down into manageable chunks, they're able to see the end result. That'll support students with ADHD. Often we'll find that they become quite defiant or they're not able to start work. Sometimes they get a label of being misbehaving, they get a label of being lazy, and actually sometimes it's just this student isn't able to get started in a task in the classroom. So always produce a waggle and always make sure that you're able to break that down into manageable chunks so that student's able to achieve. The next area I want to look at is ASD or ASC. So it's autistic spectrum disorder, and also known as autistic spectrum condition. So ASD, ASC, it's a condition that affects social interaction, communication, interests and behaviour. But autism is not an illness or a disease. You'll be surprised how many times we do hear that, and actually that's not the case at all. It's not something that a student can grow out of. It's not something that they can have medication for to change. And unfortunately, it is a condition and it's a disorder that they have to live with for the rest of their life. It's estimated that 1 in every 100 people in the UK have a diagnosis of ASD, and most people actually display autistic traits. More boys are diagnosed with the condition than girls, and girls are excellent at masking. That's why we often find that girls in school will not have a diagnosis when they join us in year 7. Very few will have a diagnosis already. We'll get a lot of boys through the system into year 7, so they'll transition to us and they've already got that diagnosis. We're already starting to see a bit of a pattern in year 9, going into year 10 of girls that are starting to really display, starting to come really to light that actually they're no longer able to cope. Their masking is starting to really deteriorate, and they're starting to be seen as students that have real clear traits of this condition. So we're starting to do some diagnosis around that. There is a real clear link between ASD and ADHD, with 50% of students going on to being diagnosed with both. And boys is actually even higher, and I couldn't find the exact statistic, but the last time that I read around this area, it was around about 65 to 70%, so it's really quite high in boys, but the average is about 50%. If a pupil profile or Mint Class states a student is undergoing a SCAT assessment, then this actually means that they're being assessed for speech communication by the assessment team. So we're really exploring, does this child need to have a diagnosis of ASD, ASC? So characteristics of someone who displays this condition. So it's social communication. Autistic people have difficulties with interpreting both verbal and non-verbal language, like gestures or tone of voice. Many have very literal understanding of language and think people always mean exactly what they say. So it's really important that when we're working with these students that we're very clear, we're very concise, and that our tone in which we speak to people and the way in which we talk to them is just really quite clear. They may find it difficult to understand or to use facial expressions. It's really hard when you say to a class of students, can you please look at me? Students with that condition of ASC or ASD, they'll really struggle with that. And what you'll find is they'll often look around your face and they won't be able to look at you, certainly not look at my eyes. Tone of voice, you'll often find that actually in a tone of voice, they will not really be able to pick up on necessarily if you're happy, if you're sad, if you're angry. So what will happen is that actually that'll become a mixed message because they won't be able to decipher what tone of voice you're using and how appropriate that is to the information that you're giving them. Jokes and sarcasm. So we love jokes in the classroom and it's great to be able to make them, but we just have to be very careful with how we do this with students that have a diagnosis of autism. And that's because they find this very difficult. So, for example, sarcasm will be lost on a student often that has autism. You will find though over time, if you're able to use sarcasm or jokes in your lesson and you explain that, then actually over time, it's a level of strategy within the classroom and intervention to be able to support that child. Because what we don't want to do is that later in life they're still not able to understand that. So it's up to us to be able to help them decipher that communication and understand what it means. So some may not speak or have very limited speech. We do have a young girl that joined us in year 7 and she displays as non-verbal when she's in a state of panic and she's trying to self-regulate. So she can be non-verbal in the morning for up to 2 hours. Social interaction. So autistic people often have difficulty reading other people, recognising or understanding others' feelings and intentions and expressing their own emotions. So this could make it very hard for them to navigate the social world. They may appear to be insensitive, seek out time alone when overloaded by other people, not seek comfort from other people, and appear to behave strangely or in a way thought to be socially inappropriate. Autistic people may find it hard to form friendships. Some may want to interact with other people and make friends, but may be unsure how to go about it. Certainly within the pastoral team and what we see within the Achievement Centre is very much that social interaction, that struggle and that difficulty to be able to make friends. In the classroom, if you're ever doing group work or you're doing paired activities, please support our students that have a diagnosis of ASD because they'll really struggle. They'll not know how to start that conversation. We have a number of students in school that we actually give them prompts on how to be able to have a conversation. And Mrs. Corley does an awful lot of work with our students for social communication skills. And that's because actually when they're in a social situation, they break down, they don't know how to interact and they really struggle to be able to get that right. So often you'll find that they may have rehearsed something and then they try to join into a social interaction and it's not really the right time or it doesn't really make sense. So it's about us as staff to be able to support those students. If you're on duty and you see a student that has a diagnosis or you recognise them as having a diagnosis of ASD, please support them. You'll often find that they may be sat on their own. That's okay if that's what they want. However, sometimes our learners will also say, actually, that's not what I want, and I want to be able to sit with friends, but they just don't know how to. So support the students with that, enable them to form friendships. And it won't be easy, and it's something that will take a considerable length of time. And some students, sadly, will reach year 11 and they've never been able to develop that skill with no matter how much support they have in place. So everything that we can do in and around school to be able to support those students, to be able to make the right social interactions is going to be really important. We talk about quite a lot in training about the noise levels and how that impacts on learning, and that's something that we're seeing quite frequently with our learners. We've had a number of learners that will come to us at the Achievement Centre and they'll say, I couldn't go to the lesson because it was too noisy. So when we talk about that, it's certainly not a level of maybe the classroom noise. It may not be that we're talking about silent study and that's not taking place. But sometimes for these students, it can be something as small as maybe the overhead projector makes a buzzing noise and they really can't cope. It could be somebody sat next to them who makes a noise totally unintentionally, but they're unable to process that. And what you'll find is that actually they can't block those sounds out. So the more that starts to happen, and the more that starts to mingle together, that then causes a sensory overload and they're not able to process things. So you'll notice again at the bottom of this slide, I've put a video on. It's really short, and it's just looking at a young man who walks into a shopping mall and just thinking about all of these different sensories going on and how difficult they find to process that. And I think that'll enable you to understand actually what these students are going through. So can you just please watch the video? That would be great. Thank you. So, students in your class, again, I've got those strategies on the right hand side. I just want you to think about students you teach who have a diagnosis or display traits of ASD, ASC. Which of your students do you have on your class list that have this diagnosis? And what changes can you make to your teaching approach that will remove barriers for our students? So again, I want you to take some of these classroom strategies and I want you to be able to run with these until the end of term, again, feeding those back to us as a team so we're able to put those strategies across the classroom. What works for these students? It's not a one size fits all. And so you may well find that what works for one student with a diagnosis of ASD isn't going to work for somebody else. The spectrum's really quite huge. So think about all your different learners. What do you know about them? And how can we support them? I've also included a top tip here as well. So we're looking at top tips for students. So develop clear daily routines. The expectation for routine. They love to be able to know exactly what to expect. It's very difficult sometimes. We refer to them as whoops moments, and that's because sometimes something arises that we just can't control. So sometimes, students do have to be exposed to those different routines. However, on the whole, the student should be able to arrive to school and that expectation and that daily routine at every lesson is always apparent. Always allow for silent study in every lesson, and that really is a real silent approach. So no sort of just students chipping away together. It's really important that students with autism are able to have that real calming relaxation within their classroom. Avoid idioms. So, example, pull your socks up. Um, it's really important that we're quite clear in our messages. So if you're referring to someone about working harder, please don't say pull your socks up, you need to be working that little bit harder, because some of them will be quite literal and they will try to pull their socks up. So we need to be very, very clear in how we're communicating with our students. And finally, support with homework. We're finding a lot of students that are struggling with their knowledge retrieval, they're struggling with their homework, and fall within the category of need. And that's because they get really confused by their homework. Often we'll find that students that have a diagnosis of autism, school is for school and home is for home, therefore they won't do work at home. We know they have to, so it's about putting the processes in place to ensure that they're able to do that at home. So what we'll find is if a student looks at their homework and they're really struggling to understand it, and they haven't really got an understanding of what they need to do and the task is a full, they won't take time to be able to understand that. They wouldn't come seek for your support. So it's really important that when you're setting the homework, that it's really clear to that student and it makes sense exactly what they need to be doing. If not, if you've given them a little script to go in their planner, and can you make sure that you support in more detail, and we've got teams at the moment, which is great, so please use that when setting an assignment, and so it means that you're able to really break down that homework into step-by-step support network for that student. That's really important. So the next thing that we're going to have a little look at is dyspraxia. So this is known as DCD, and it's developmental coordination disorder. So dyspraxia is a form of developmental coordination disorder. It's a common disorder affecting the fine and the gross motor coordination in children and adults. It may also affect speech. An individual's coordination difficulty may affect participation and function in everyday life skills in education. Students may present with difficulties with self-care, writing, typing, riding a bike, and play, as well as other educational recreational activities. There may be a range of co-occurring difficulties which can also have a serious negative impact on daily life. So these include social and emotional difficulties, as well as problems with time management, planning, and personal organisation. And dyspraxia can also affect articulation and speech, perception and thought. We have a number of students in school, especially our high profile SEND students, that have a diagnosis of dyspraxia. So what are the characteristics? So characteristics tend to vary depending on the age of the individual, and some of the general symptoms of dyspraxia include poor balance, poor posture, fatigue, clumsiness, differences in speech, perception problems, poor hand-eye coordination, disorganised and forgetful. So what difficulties would a student have if they have a diagnosis of dyspraxia? They really struggle with coordination, balance and movement. That could be something as simple as sitting on a chair. It could be something as more complex as trying to climb the wall in the climbing wall within PE. So it really is a difficulty for these students. How students learn new skills, so think and remember information at school. So they find it really difficult to be able to learn new skills. That's why it's so important that we use Helen's training to be able to break that down into manageable chunks. We've done a wealth of training on the Rosenshine principles using your walkthrough book. So please use that, because we'll find actually being able to support students in their new skills, their new information, and being able to have strategies to adapt and allow them to learn is going to be really helpful for these individuals. Daily living skills, so such as dressing or preparing meals, so tying shoelaces, doing shirt buttons. A lot of our students struggle with that. Not only those students with a diagnosis of DCD, we'll also find students that have ASD also struggle with this. We have a number of students who look like they have shoelaces, but they're actually elastic and they're already pre-tied, so they can slip their foot into their shoe. We have a number of students that have, for example, they have shirt buttons down the front, but actually underneath that it might be Velcro, so their shirt sticks together, because they just don't have that fine motor skill to be able to do those really small and intricate details. Students' ability to write, type, draw and grasp small objects. Again, that fine motor skill difficulty, being able to really clench onto something. They'll find drawing, especially in art, and the different bits of equipment particularly difficult. Maybe in DT, when they're having to use really small items, like really small screws, for example, they'll find those things very difficult to be able to do. How students function in social situations, again, that's a real difficulty for students that have a diagnosis of DCD, and that's because they have an awful lot of traits that fall inside with autism. So again, when we're looking at supporting our students in school and we're thinking about being able to help them in social situations, please do support those students, again, on duty within your classroom. It's about the whole school context. It's about ensuring that we really are there to support our students with everything to be able to lead them up to an adult life. How students deal with your emotions, so how they deal with their own and how they deal with other people's emotions. The students with DCD really struggle with that, and that's because they don't have a clear understanding of emotions themselves. So if someone's upset, they'll be particularly distraught, and they may well be attracted to that, and they won't be able to leave that student alone until actually they're able to move on, because that child's so distressed, they'll want to stay with that child and comfort them. You may also find a child with DCD could walk past a student that's incredibly upset because they have no regulation in their emotions. So they're very different. No two child is the same. However, emotions is also a real key area to be able to support these young learners. And finally, time management, planning and personal organisation skills. These students will find even the simplest of tasks of getting their planner out, their knowledge organiser, their whiteboard, their equipment, it's so overwhelming for those students. Yes, they have to do it. However, help them on their desk, help them lay it out properly. What you'll find is that they'll put everything on their desk in the middle, they'll have their workbooks on top, they'll have the information sheets they may have been issued, their resources, and everything all gets piled on top of each other. It's about being able to support that child in their personal space. What can you do to help them? Organise their table, show them. You might have to go back and do this time and time again, lesson after lesson. It may well take over a year or two to be able to get this process in place for this child, but eventually that child will pick up that skill and they'll be able to use that. So it's just about the repetitiveness of it. But with these children, I think what's really important is that we don't just say, oh, well, I showed you last week, or we have to revisit, and we always have to make sure that we're really supporting these students every lesson, because these small fine details, like having a clear work area, allows them to focus on their work and not have distractions of an unmessy work area. So again, finally, I want you to think about students that have a diagnosis of dyspraxia in your classroom. Which of your students on your class list have dyspraxia? Can you identify them? And what changes can you make your teaching approach that will remove barriers for these students? So again, you'll notice I've put the classroom strategies on there. So you can just have a couple of minutes just to think about that. What can you do to support the students? Again, I want the feedback on this at the end of term, so it means that we're able to share this good practice across school. I've included a top teaching tip for students with dyspraxia. So adjust seating plans. It's often beneficial to place students with dyspraxia at the front of the room so they have an easier view of the boards. They may also find it easier to concentrate when distanced from doors, windows, bulletins and other classroom distractions, because what they will find is that it all becomes that just too overwhelming for them. So if you can really think about where you're seating these students, I think that'll be a real support to those students. So I've actually come to the end of the training session, and I know that was a real whistle-stop tour. I really do hope that you've been able to take something from this. I've emailed curriculum leaders with an overview of ASD, ADHD and dyspraxia. So I'm hoping that the curriculum leaders will pass that on to you. So please have that when you're planning. Think about the classroom strategies. Use Mint Class. We've got a wealth of strategies on there. Like I say, if you've got other strategies you're using with these students, that's brilliant, but we need to know about them as a team. If we're not known about these strategies, we're not able to add them and share that good practice across school. So it's really important that we're having this information fed back. Any student, not just the three areas that we've looked at today, but any other of those special educational needs for students we're supporting in school, if you have a strategy that works for them, please do share that. I've also got one final request, if that's okay. I've done a send questionnaire for staff, and I was wondering if you're able to fill that in and get that back to me. If you could please do that by the Friday, that would be great. Just so it means I can collate all the information in, look at our future training and how I can support the team moving forward. But if you've got any questions or concerns, please get in touch. But that's the end of our session for today. Thank you ever so much for listening. Take care. Bye now.